I'd like to take a few moments and talk about a little bit of some of the ideas that have come out of the Stone reading and some of the things that have been shared over the past week and a half online in your discussion board responses to the Stone reading. So what you should be able to see in this archive is the policy paradox, the art of political decision-making, which is the Stone reading, which was long. I know it's a long reading, but I think it's important for a couple of reasons. First, it's important for us to get an understanding of how the term policy influences our discussion of the topic area of ocean policy and law, or maybe said another way, how policy influences the way in which we interact with our coastal and ocean resources. So that's the first thing, the first point that we can make. Now, some of you might have taken the PST 500 or have a background, a foundation in public policy already. Others of you may have not have taken that course or have a background in public policy. In either case, the purpose of the Stone reading being our first reading in ocean policy and law is to give us a foundation or grounding in these concepts, in some basic concepts of what it means when we talk about public policy. Of course, the Stone reading talks about goals most specifically and the achievement of goals. We think of this as very much a linear process, meaning that, a goal is established, a good idea from a public policy standpoint. It might be debated. We know that we have elected officials that debate things. At some point, that good idea is legitimized through the process of lawmaking, at least here in the United States. That law then is carried out, implemented, and then maybe sometimes there's an evaluation process that goes on where we look at whether or not the policy that was enacted is actually means something, actually is meeting its objectives, for instance. Well, what we learn from Stone, or what we should start thinking about, is that, if we really don't have a very good idea up front as to how we're going to define our goals and the metrics maybe in which we reach those goals and analyze whether or not we reach those goals, then it's going to be difficult for us to determine whether a policy is actually effective. I think in one of the discussion board responses, or one of the comments that I made to a response, I indicated that many times the superficial focus in the world of public policy is on inputs and outputs, meaning, for instance, Congress might, with its spending power, decide to fund a public agency with, let's say, $3 billion worth of funding for a fiscal year. At the end of that year, Congress might call a hearing, and at that hearing, the head of that public agency might come forward and might explain that, well, you gave us $3 billion and we spent $3 billion. So that's sort of the input being monetary in this sense, and the output being monetary. I think in many ways, our budget, our federal budget on a yearly basis, is an example of an input-output, where we take in so much money in terms of the federal income. We establish a budget. Usually the executive proposes a budget, but then the legislature actually creates the budget. And then we spend money. And if we look at the major categories within that federal budget, we can start thinking about more or deeper questions. For instance, we know that we might spend 23% of our federal budget in a given year on defense spending. We know that comes to a significant amount of money, but we really don't know exactly the details of how that money is being spent. And more importantly, whether or not the money that is being spent is meeting the overall overriding objective of security, of actual defense of the United States. And within the multitude of programs that are offered under the umbrella of defense, whether or not any of those particular areas are being met. And this is just one example of how we can start thinking about some of the things that Stone has talked about in her reading and applying it to the general principles of policy. Moving on to another slide I have here. And if you remember from Stone's reading, she establishes the different concepts of equality. and equality being, in its most basic sense, the same size or share for everybody. And we know that there are complications that Stone talks about in the polis, specifically a number of dimensions, issues, and dilemmas that are created. And so, what she brings up essentially here is the difference between the notion of equality and possibly equity. Something that is equal is not necessarily equitable in terms of distributions. And I think that alone is an important thing to consider, how we define our terms, and specifically what variables we are considering and not considering as we define our terms in the world of public policy. Because the way in which we define those terms, and you will see this play itself out very much in the law, in the legal aspects, the way in which words are defined, speaks heavily as to whether or not a policy is moving in a particular direction A versus a direction B, for instance. So that's something to consider. We also have, beyond the concepts of equality, Stone discussed concepts of efficiency. The simple definition is the getting the most output for a given input. And the question of efficiency is a difficult one when it comes to public policy. This was discussed in early discussion board responses. I believe John, who's an economist who works, I believe, for NOAA Fisheries, for our federal fisheries agency, John had talked about how efficiency is something that economists focus on, and they have many times explicit ways of defining efficiency. I think one of the problems that comes up when we think about efficiency is how that sort of jives with our basic moral understandings. The example that I think of is, it seems to me, in a cold, hard, calculated sense, that it's highly inefficient the way in which we treat condemned prisoners, those that are condemned in certain states in the federal government to receive the death penalty, for instance. If we have determined that a person within a court of law, under our particular legal system, given all noted due process that we feel is fair and moral to provide, if we have convicted this person of a capital crime and they are to receive the death penalty, it seems we could argue it is most efficient to simply carry out the penalty itself without offering them a long period of potential appeal, or essentially just the time in which we have to house this person for a period of years, sometimes decades, prior to them actually receiving the death penalty. One example that comes to mind to highlight this is how China has traditionally dealt with those that have been subject to the death penalty in their country. They carry out the penalty quickly, efficiently, and traditionally they have also charged the cost of the execution to the family members, the remaining living family members of the person who has been executed. That seems highly efficient, meaning that the amount of resources that's required in order to carry out the capital punishment are relatively minimal, whereas the amount of resources saved in terms of having to house the prisoner and feed the prisoner and clothe the prisoner and otherwise care for their medical conditions, etc., for a period of years to decades, that seems highly inefficient. Now, if we think about this, we might say that what you're saying seems highly immoral to me, that just for the sake of saving a few dollars, we should summarily kill somebody prior to them receiving what would be considered additional due process considerations, our sort of moral foundational issues that are contained in our United States Constitution, our Bill of Rights, for example, possibly the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, those sort of things. These are all, in their essence, morality questions. And so you might say, well, it might not be super efficient in a cold, calculated sense to allow for all of these additional sort of protections to somebody who has been convicted of a capital crime, but it just seems fair, more equitable that our system allow for these sort of processes to carry out. And so in this example, maybe we can begin to see that the term efficiency or the concepts of efficiency are not clear when it comes to the additional layer or consideration of social implications, social mores, social values, the things that we care about and cherish most as a country, as a nation. And I think Stone does a pretty decent job of explaining how those variables interact with our concepts of efficiency. That's something we might consider. There's also, Stone discussed, is there an equality-efficiency trade-off, right? Is there a trade-off between equality and efficiency? And there are arguments for and against. And I would suggest that you look at this particular figure or table in the Stone reading or here on the presentation board, and to consider the different arguments for and against whether or not there's an equality-efficiency trade-off. I think it's something that, upon reflection, if you come to some understanding of the difficulties, not necessarily an answer, but the difficulties inherent in this sort of debate, I think it will serve you well as you move forward in not only this course, but the other courses related to public policy. You'll also notice that in the Stone reading, she identifies some of the challenges to efficiency as a criterion for social welfare. This is just something that gives a further in-depth example within the context of social welfare of some of the concepts that we've been talking about. Not to make this too long, but to finish off here, one way in which we might think about approaching questions of policy in terms of making sure that our inputs have the correct amount of variables and that our outputs are somewhat measurable, meaning that we can actually evaluate whether or not we're meeting a particular objective or goal, is to use something. I have here one example of a multiple criteria analysis decision-making process. And it's just one example of different ways in which we can think about the greater complexities that Stone sort of highlights in her reading and how we might want to be more complex in our upfront approach to identifying a problem, and then potentially to setting an agenda to establishing criteria in which we go about resolving that problem through public policy. You'll see here there's the identification, these neat little things here. There's the identification of objectives, there is the identification of criteria, the number of options, identification of options, obtain performance measures, specific utility function, transform criteria, weighting the criteria. Not all criteria is created equal, so says Stone, and that weighting of the criteria is an example of that. Equity versus equality. I guess another way of saying this is the cake, the distribution of the cake might not be in equal shares, as that example. Ranking or scoring the options, some form of sensitivity analysis, and that is using statistical analysis to ensure that the ultimate outcome is being honest as to the different weights potentially and the different sort of measures we're using. And then, of course, you come to your final choice. And you can see that this is broken down into phases. There's phase one, which is the problem structuring, phase two of the analysis itself, and then phase three of the actual judgment. Well, as I said, this is one way to begin thinking about sort of the policy-making process and what is a legitimate way of allowing for some of the issues Stone identifies and taking account of those issues as we move forward in public policy decision-making.